The moment the gate agent's voice cut through Terminal C at Logan International, the entire boarding area seemed to hold its breath. "Ma'am, you cannot sit there. That seat isn't assigned to you." The words were sharp, surgical, and carried the weight of 1,000 assumptions. Passengers paused mid-step carts, stalling bags suspended in mid-air. Everyone turned, but no one expected the calm, deliberate figure standing at the entrance of the jet bridge. Clara Whitman, 52, adjusted the strap of her understated leather tote and met the agent's gaze. Her short, silver-streaked hair framed a face that had been carved by years of scrutiny and high-stakes negotiations. She looked like any other professional woman rushing to her flight, yet within her presence was a quiet authority few could sense. No one knew that with a single phone call she could alter the trajectory of this flight, and not just this flight, but the operations of the airline itself. The young gate attendant, Jenna Collins, 28, blinked rapidly, caught between protocol and instinct. She had processed countless first-class passengers, but something about Clara unsettled her. The sharpness in Clara's eyes was different. It was calm, but it carried the faint undertone of someone accustomed to influence someone whose words moved entire boards and shifted markets. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass," Jenna said, her tone firm, yet betraying a tremor of doubt. Clara produced it slowly, letting the polished cardstock slide across the counter, the light glinting off the embossed gold lettering of her last name. She held her hand lightly above it, almost ceremoniously, and then withdrew, letting the silence stretch. Behind her, an older couple whispered to each other. "Who does she think she is?" the man muttered. "I swear these people think rules don't apply to them anymore." The woman shook her head, adjusting her scarf eyes, flicking toward Clara's calm stance. Jenna examined the boarding pass, squinting, frowning. I need to check this with the system," she muttered. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant. Somewhere in the corner, a middle-aged businessman smirked, thinking he recognized a rare opportunity to document a spectacle. From behind the hum of wheels on tile, the echo of rolling luggage, the distant calls of other gates, all created a cinematic rhythm, a heartbeat in sync with Clara's own measured breathing. She stepped forward slowly, letting her presence occupy the space between the agent and the door. "Ma'am, I really must insist," Jenna said, her voice rising slightly. "You can't sit there. You'll have to move to 2C. Clara's lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but a mask of patience sharpened by decades of reading, intent, and masking power. "Why should I?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with authority, the kind that made nearby travelers instinctively lean in, catching every nuance. "My boarding pass says 2A. This is my seat." The murmurs grew. The man recording with his smartphone whispered, "Watch this. She's about to cause a scene." The elderly woman clutched her purse tighter. A few teens glancing at their phones perked up. Jenna's brow knitted. There must be some mistake. Our system shows it reserved for another passenger. She glanced toward the jet bridge, toward a tall woman in her mid-40s, stepping up with the confidence of someone who never questioned her entitlement. Evelyn Harper, platinum status, frequent flyer known to the crew for her generosity, with tips and her sharp expectations, approached. Clara did not flinch. Her eyes traced Evelyn's approach, noting the calculated sway of her stride, the gleam of her designer handbag under the fluorescent lights. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, her voice smooth but clipped. "Excuse me. That is my seat." The subtle power play unfolded in real time, layered like a chessboard. Clara's shoulders remained squared, her gaze steady. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't angry. She was a calm force, assessing and cataloguing. The airline staff, the passengers, even the gate agents felt the charge of the standoff. "You're asking me to surrender my space," Clara said, her tone low and precise, letting each word land like a scalpel. "Why is that?" Evelyn raised an eyebrow, a practiced, almost theatrical lift. "I have been flying here for over a decade. This is standard procedure." Clara's hand hovered just above her tote strap. The gesture was deliberate, commanding attention, without aggression. "Standard procedure," she repeated, letting the words hang. "Or standard perception." She paused, letting a subtle edge of disbelief infiltrate the air. "Because from where I'm standing, perception doesn't define policy, nor does preference." Jenna glanced nervously between the two women. She felt her authority slipping. Nearby passengers shifted, some glancing at their phones, some leaning forward, curious yet unsure how to react. One older man whispered, "This feels wrong. Something about this feels very wrong." Clara's mind was already calculating quietly, deliberately. She was aware of her leverage. She was a minority, with influence, a stakeholder in the airline through discreet ownership, though no one on the ground knew. She could have escalated the moment with one call, but she chose observation first, letting the tension swell, letting the social dynamics reveal themselves. Evelyn's expression tightened. She sensed she had underestimated this woman. "You don't understand how things work here," she said, sharper now. "People like you don't usually sit in first class." The words struck a chord with the surrounding passengers. A younger woman filming discreetly whispered into her mic, "Look at that, they're treating her like she doesn't belong." A hush spread the terminal noises, fading beneath the undercurrent of moral tension. Clara's lips barely moved. "People like me," she said, softly measured. "I do belong. My seat is 2A. I have earned it." The statement was simple, yet absolute, slicing through assumptions, prejudice, and the quiet complacency of those who witness inequity without action. Evelyn's mouth tightened, a fleeting smirk, replaced by subtle tension. She had expected compliance, not confrontation. She did not yet know that Clara's quiet assertion carried hidden weight. She could influence the airline's internal review, its public perception, and its policies, all from this single confrontation. The gate buzzed. A senior security officer appeared, his steps measured. "Ma'am, can I see your documents?" he asked, voice professional, neutral. Clara handed over her boarding pass and ID. Each detail matched flawlessly. The officer's eyes flicked to Evelyn, then back at Clara, uncertainty creeping in. In those moments, the terminal seemed to stretch. Clara stood there, small enough to appear ordinary, yet impossible to ignore. Each passenger felt the weight of the tableau privilege, confronted by calm authority. Assumptions questioned, silent judgments laid bare. She wasn't just holding a seat. She was holding a mirror, up to every observer, reflecting discomfort, unspoken prejudice, and the quiet moral imperative to recognize merit and dignity. And in that pregnant pause, as the boarding gate hummed and the overhead displays blinked, flight updates, Clara knew the game had shifted. One call could escalate, one word could change policy, but for now she allowed the tension to rise, the terminal air thick with anticipation, her presence a storm held in perfect, unyielding balance. Her gaze swept the crowd once more. Every assumption, every glance, every whispered opinion would be catalogued. Every choice, every hesitation would matter. And in that stillness, she waited, watching for the moment when reality would finally bend to accountability. Passengers leaned forward. Phones were raised, breath caught in throats, and Clara Whitman remained unmoved, a single woman in the midst of authority entitlement and systemic expectation, holding her ground with a quiet power no one in the terminal could yet fathom. The cabin door hissed closed behind the last boarding passenger, and a heavy stillness settled over Flight 721. Clara Whitman remained in seat 2, A-posture erect, hands folded lightly over her tote. The ambient hum of the engines had begun, yet the tension in the first-class cabin was louder than any mechanical sound. Evelyn Carter, seated diagonally across the aisle, narrowed her eyes. Her usual aura of command seemed brittle now, as if the confidence she had wielded effortlessly for years had met its first real test. Laura Bennett hovered near the galley shoulders, tight jaw clenched. She had expected a minor negotiation, a routine request to shift a seat. Instead, she faced a woman whose quiet authority radiated through the cabin, touching every passenger's conscience. Passengers shifted, subtly glances darting between the two women, the sense of collective observation thickening like mist. One older man in row 4 adjusted his glasses, peering over the rim eyebrows, knit in a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. A couple of travelers in their 60s murmured quietly words lost beneath the ambient cabin sounds, but their eyes never left Clara. Evelyn's voice, smooth yet sharp, broke the silence. "You do realize this is my flight, right? I've flown this route for over a decade. Platinum status. You're making a scene that doesn't need to happen." She leaned slightly forward, the gleam of her watch catching the soft overhead light. Every flicker of her gestures had been honed over years to convey entitlement without aggression. It was a practiced power, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the cabin might bend under it. Clara's lips curled just enough to hint at a controlled acknowledgement of Evelyn's presence, but she did not yield. Her eyes scanned the cabin slowly, taking in every passenger, every subtle reaction, every breath held in anticipation. "I understand," she said quietly, voice low and deliberate, "that you have expectations. But expectations do not override assigned rights. This seat belongs to me, and I intend to remain here." Her words landed like small detonations in the charged air. Laura's hands clenched. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, rapid and insistent. She wanted to intervene to assert her authority as crew, but every instinct screamed caution. Clara's composure was not arrogance. It was command disguised as calm. The passengers, many of whom had silently tolerated 100 minor slights over the years, began to sense something larger unfolding. Some felt solidarity stir quietly, others unease. The young man in row 2, a retired engineer in his late 60s, adjusted his seatbelt and leaned forward, fingers-laced eyes narrowing in careful scrutiny. This was more than a seating dispute. It was a test of conscience. Evelyn's hand twitched toward the armrest between them, a subtle maneuver meant to claim psychological space. "Perhaps the crew can find you another seat." Further back, she suggested the words, polished, almost perfumed with authority. Clara did not flinch. She reached for her boarding pass and ID, letting them rest on her lap, visible but unassuming. The metallic reflection of the gold-embossed lettering caught the cabin lights a quiet signal, an unspoken revelation. She was not an ordinary passenger, and even Evelyn did not yet understand the depth of her influence. A soft click from the galley door drew attention. Captain Michael Hawthorne. 59, tall, with streaked grey hair, and a presence honed by decades in the air, appeared his eyes, sweeping the cabin with habitual precision. He stopped at the front, assessing, calibrating, not yet speaking. He had flown thousands of flights, faced countless minor disturbances, and yet the air of this particular standoff prickled the back of his neck with something unfamiliar. It was not fear, but recognition of stakes, unseen consequences, unspoken. Laura cleared her throat, stepping closer to Clara, as if to shield the aisle, her voice tight. "Ma'am, we need to resolve this before pushback," she said, keeping the words clipped. Clara's head tilted slightly, allowing her gaze to skim over Laura's face. She noted the subtle tremor of tension beneath the professional mask, the friction of moral judgment, fighting loyalty. "We are not in disagreement about safety," Clara replied. "We are in disagreement about entitlement. My seat has been confirmed for weeks. My presence here poses no risk." Evelyn's jaw tightened. She leaned back, crossing her legs with deliberate precision, the subtle creak of her leather shoe against the floor like a punctuation in the conversation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Her voice was silk over steel. Clara's eyes met hers directly, unwavering. "Not yet," she said, the corner of her mouth hinting at a controlled smile. "But soon you will understand." The cabin air seemed to pulse, each passenger suddenly conscious of every inhalation, every subtle movement. In row 3, a retired airline executive, 71, gripped his armrests, eyes narrowing. He recognized the markers of authority, the patterns of power. His memory stirred, decades of observing corporate hierarchy of silent acquiescence, now colliding with an unassailable calm. Jenna Collins, the gate attendant, stepped closer to Evelyn, her professional smile faltering. "We can resolve this," she said, though her tone betrayed uncertainty. "There's a seat in 2C. Evelyn's gaze flicked to the suggested spot. She tensed, recognizing the subtle shift in control, the threat of defiance. The murmurs of passengers grew a low undertone that hinted at alignment, sympathy, and the stirring of collective judgment. Clara's hand rested lightly on the armrest, a measured presence that did not intrude but filled the space. Her mind catalogued every glance, every twitch, every flicker of doubt. The young woman in row 564, quietly adjusting her scarf, whispered to her companion. "She's not just standing her ground, she's exposing something." The older man nodded, eyes still fixed on Clara, as if seeing a reflection of every time he had witnessed injustice and remained silent. Evelyn's patience thinned, her voice sharpened, carrying through the cabin just enough for everyone to hear. "I can have this resolved immediately. One call, and this will be taken care of." She lifted her phone slightly, an unspoken threat hanging in the air. Clara's eyes followed the motion, unflinching, steady. She didn't move, didn't panic. She waited. The cabin felt taut, a wire stretched to breaking anticipation crackling. Captain Hawthorne finally stepped forward, voice deep and even. "What seems to be the issue?" he asked, scanning both parties, reading tension, evaluating risk. His gaze lingered on Clara, noting the steadiness, the calm assessment, the aura of command that seemed to extend beyond her age and stature. Evelyn began to assert. This passenger, Clara interrupted with a quiet authority that carried. "Captain, I am in my assigned seat. I have complied with all rules and regulations. I have no dispute with the airline. This is not about disruption. It is about being treated according to what has been assigned." Her voice, low but resonant, filled the space between seats, making each word count sharp enough to cut through assumptions, entitlement, and subtle bias. The first twist arrived silently, a notification on Clara's tablet disguised as a casual glance at a flight update revealed that she had access to internal communications. Her proxy position as a minor shareholder gave her insight into operational decisions. She did not act, yet merely allowed the knowledge to weigh. Every blink, every movement was catalogued in the minds of those who could sense the shift. This was no ordinary passenger confrontation. Passengers exchanged glances. Some leaned forward, hearts quickening. Some exhaled slowly, feeling the gravity. The man across the aisle, retired banker, whispered, "I've never seen a passenger command a terminal like this." Clara's eyes flicked briefly toward the elderly woman in row 6, who nodded imperceptibly. Recognition, validation, moral alignment in the theater of air travel. Evelyn's expression shifted imperceptibly at first, then more visibly. Her platinum confidence faltered as the first wave of doubt crept in. The subtle acknowledgement that the person she had intended to intimidate might hold unseen leverage caused her breath to hitch, slightly, lips pressing thin. She had underestimated her counterpart. The subtle second twist, Laura Bennett, the crew member who had been following protocol mechanically, felt an internal conflict rise. Years of executing entitlement-based preferential treatment collided with an emerging moral imperative. She swallowed eyes, flicking to Clara, sensing the authority beneath calmness, sensing the accountability she had skirted for so long. Clara's final words before boarding commenced were quiet, deliberate, piercing. "This seat is mine. I am staying. I suggest we proceed with dignity, or we bear witness to the consequences of assumption." Passengers inhaled collectively. The hum of the engines seemed distant, now irrelevant. The boarding area, the aisle, the lights all faded to a cinematic tableau of human will, subtle power, and moral reckoning. Every observer in that cabin understood that what unfolded was larger than 2 seats, larger than entitlement, larger than protocol. And in that silent electric pause, Clara Whitman sat back, a quiet storm restrained only by discipline, watching the subtle cracks appear in entitlement, authority, and perception, knowing the first move of the true confrontation had just begun. The cabin settled into a tense silence as the door sealed behind the last passenger. Clara Whitman remained in her seat, hands folded neatly, eyes scanning every inch of the first-class cabin. The subtle whir of the air conditioning mixed with the soft hum of the engines, but nothing could diminish the intensity of the standoff. Evelyn Carter, her platinum card lying on the armrest like a shield, kept her gaze fixed on Clara, calculating, measuring. Every muscle in her body carried the weight of expectation and entitlement, and for the first time that weight wavered. Laura Bennett hovered near the galley, her posture, rigid lips pressed together. Her mind raced, retracing the protocol, the rules, the proper chain of command, but none of it seemed to provide guidance for a passenger who refused politely, but with absolute certainty. She glanced at Captain Michael Hawthorne, who was standing near the cockpit door, his face, unreadable eyes trained on Clara, as if assessing a storm barely contained. From row 3, the retired airline executive shifted, leaning forward with interest, now sharpened into recognition. He knew these dynamics well, had witnessed decades of deference and quiet coercion, but this was different. The calm authority emanating from Clara disrupted the invisible hierarchy that had always governed interactions in first-class cabins. Clara adjusted the strap of her tote, letting her fingers linger lightly over the edge, not in threat, not in ostentation, but in deliberate demonstration of control. "Captain," she said, voice low, resonant, measured. "I am not challenging your authority. I am following every safety protocol. I am merely requesting that protocol be applied equally." The cabin seemed to tighten around her words, the subtle pause like a drawn bowstring ready to release. Evelyn leaned forward, voice silky and sharp. "You are overstepping. This is not a negotiation. I am a long-standing customer. My expectations are clear. You will move or I will escalate." Her hand moved to her phone again, a silent threat. Fingers poised. Clara's eyes flicked briefly to it, noting the motion, then returned to Evelyn's face. "I have no intention of escalating. I am here to observe and ensure fairness. The escalation is on you if you cannot meet your own standards." Passengers shifted subtly, some leaning forward, others reclining, slightly absorbing the gravity. The elderly couple in row 4 whispered, "She's calm, but there's fire beneath it." A young woman in row 2 early 60s carefully angled her phone, not for viral capture, but to record for memory a personal testament to witnessing dignity in conflict. Captain Hawthorne finally stepped closer, voice firm, yet neutral. "We have to maintain schedule. I need cooperation from all passengers to ensure safety and timely departure." His eyes lingered on Clara, measuring, evaluating. She did not flinch. She did not hesitate. "Captain, I am cooperating. I am in my assigned seat. The disruption comes from assumptions, not my compliance." Laura exhaled slowly, realizing that enforcing protocol on this passenger would do nothing but amplify tension. She glanced at Evelyn, who now shifted uneasily, her polished composure cracking slightly. Clara's eyes swept the cabin, catching the subtle acknowledgments from passengers, the quiet nods from those who had long observed injustice but felt powerless to intervene. The first twist came silently. Clara had prepared for this. Beneath the surface calm, she had discreetly activated a communication with her legal counsel, positioned in Boston, ready to verify her seat assignment, her rights, and to document any impropriety. It was not an immediate escalation, merely a safety net, but the knowledge sharpened her focus. Every gesture now counted, every look, every pause, every syllable. Evelyn, sensing the imperceptible shift in power, pressed further. "Do you even understand the implications I can make calls? I know people here." Her voice carried the luxury of influence, the invisible currency of years of privilege. Clara's gaze hardened, soft but unyielding. "I understand exactly. And I understand that influence does not equate to entitlement over what has been properly assigned." The cabin atmosphere shifted again imperceptibly at first, then more pronounced. Flight attendants straightened in their positions, some uncertain, others silently taking note. The older businessman in row 5, retired airline consultant, whispered under his breath, "She's turning their own rules back on them." His companion leaned in, eyes wide. The entire first-class cabin, 50 passengers or so, became an audience to a subtle but relentless assertion of fairness. Evelyn's hand brushed against her handbag, the motion slight, almost imperceptible, but calculated to signal a threat. Clara followed the movement, with her eyes registering the intent, not reacting, letting it hang like a question in the air. Captain Clara said, voice steady, deliberate, "I am aware of the suggested reassignment. I am requesting confirmation that all passengers are treated equally, according to the airline's documented policies, without preference bias or assumption." Laura Bennett swallowed hard, feeling the weight of authority slip from her fingertips. She realized that the routine, the predictable chain of command, had met a force outside of its framework, a subtle challenge she could not enforce without conflict. She glanced at the other crew members, noting the small adjustments in posture, the exchange of glances, a ripple of moral reckoning. Evelyn's composure began to fray. This is absurd. You are just one passenger. One person cannot dictate policy. You cannot, Clara's voice cut through without raising volume, precise and authoritative. I am not dictating policy. I am documenting compliance. I am requesting adherence. If the system works as stated, all passengers will be treated according to assignment. If it does not, the failure will be visible, and accountability will follow. A retired pilot in row 368 shifted forward. He had seen countless minor disputes, but the clarity and resolve emanating from Clara unsettled him. His hands rested lightly on his knees, eyes scanning the cabin, absorbing the interplay of entitlement, authority, and reason. He noted the subtle cues, Evelyn's tension, Laura's hesitation, the passengers' shifting attention. The subtle second twist arrived with the incoming flight operations message. Clara's assistant, positioned at a secured communications terminal in Boston, discreetly transmitted confirmation of seat assignments and historical passenger data to Clara's encrypted tablet. It arrived silently, unnoticed by the crew, a silent reinforcement of her position. She did not act immediately, merely allowed it to inform her judgment, sharpening her precision. Evelyn's voice grew sharper, more commanding, attempting to reassert psychological dominance. I have connections. I can have this situation resolved instantly. All you are doing is causing a delay for everyone. Clara's gaze met hers, evenly unwavering. Connections and influence are not a substitute for fairness. The delay is a product of assumption and misapplied authority, not compliance. The cabin seemed to contract around the exchange. Passengers leaned slightly forward, absorbed their focus, rapt. The elderly couple in row 4 exhaled slowly, a mixture of tension and approval. The retired executive muttered under his breath, "Finally." Someone holding the line. Laura Bennett, sensing that the standoff had reached a critical point, glanced at the captain again. Captain Hawthorne's jaw tightened, eyes scanning, calculating risk versus procedure. Clara continued to project calm authority, every word measured, every pause deliberate, each sentence building toward an unseen climax. The air seemed to hold collectively, every passenger crew member and observer caught in the suspended tension. Clara's hands rested lightly on her taut elbows, brushing against the armrest, a subtle but deliberate occupation of space. Every movement, every shift of posture, every measured glance became part of the narrative, unfolding in real time, a tableau of quiet power, challenging perceived privilege. Finally, Clara's voice cut through with a controlled finality. "This seat is mine. I am staying. I am compliant. I expect the same for every passenger. Observation is ongoing, and accountability will follow." The words landed subtle but absolute, and the cabin exhaled collectively, recognizing that something larger than a seating dispute was now in motion, a moral reckoning silently taking hold in the midst of ordinary air travel. Passengers shifted, some nodding imperceptibly, others leaning back, absorbing the weight of what they had witnessed. Evelyn's hand relaxed slightly, tension rippling through her face as she realized that authority was not absolute, and entitlement had met its first unflinching challenge. Laura Bennett straightened her mind, racing to reconcile procedure with observation, and Captain Hawthorne finally allowed a slow exhale, acknowledging the presence of a force he could not simply override. Clara remained seated, poised, calm, her eyes scanning the cabin one final time. Every observer, every subtle gesture, every micro-expression had been accounted for. The stage was set. The conflict was now fully established. And in that quiet, taut moment, the first chapter of what would become a reckoning for the airline concluded, the passengers and crew alike unknowingly participating in a lesson about power fairness and the unassailable authority of presence and principle. The engines roared to life as the boarding door sealed completely, but the tension in first class had not eased. Clara Whitman remained in seat 2, a hands lightly resting on her toe ties, scanning the cabin like a camera lens, capturing every subtle reaction. Evelyn Carter, seated across the aisle, tightened her grip on the armrest, knuckles whitening. Her polished veneer of authority was beginning to show cracks, small but undeniable. She had assumed control of this flight, yet here was a passenger whose calm defiance was creating ripples that no social status could immediately counter. Laura Bennett hovered near the galley, her posture taut, glancing between Clara and Evelyn. Every instinct screamed for her to enforce compliance, but another part of her, the part she had buried beneath years of routine, whispered doubt. The crew had been trained to maintain order, yet no training could predict the presence of a passenger whose quiet authority reframed the situation entirely. She adjusted the hem of her uniform, exhaling slowly, trying to center herself, but her eyes kept returning to Clara, noting the subtle control she exuded without raising her voice. The passengers were an audience now. Some older travelers leaned forward, slightly, curiosity mingled with recognition, as if sensing a moment larger than themselves. Others in their 60s, accustomed to deference and protocol, glanced between the two women, unsure where their sympathies should lie. A man with silver hair in row 4, retired airline executive, shifted in his seat, hands clasped lightly in front of him. He had observed countless conflicts, minor and major, yet this situation felt unprecedented. There was a moral architecture being revealed here, an invisible hierarchy of fairness and entitlement being quietly tested. Evelyn Carter leaned slightly forward, voice smooth but firm. "This is unnecessary. I am a platinum member. I've flown this route for years. This seat is mine. You are causing a delay that affects everyone." Her words were precise, carefully enunciated, designed to assert dominance without sounding overtly aggressive. She let her gaze sweep across the cabin, as though reminding passengers of her influence, the connections she assumed would bend the rules in her favor. Clara's head tilted fractionally, her eyes meeting Evelyn's with unwavering calm. "I understand your expectations," she said, low and deliberate, "but expectations do not overwrite confirmed assignments. Every passenger is entitled to the space they have reserved. I am here to observe fairness, not disrupt it." Her words carried a weight that made passengers lean forward, subtly taking in the gravity of what was being said. The older man in row 4 muttered under his breath, finally someone holding them accountable. Laura Bennett's throat tightened. She wanted to intervene, but recognized the delicate balance. Any abrupt action could escalate the situation. She exhaled quietly, her mind spinning through regulations, possible consequences, and the invisible pressure of social perception. Evelyn's eyes flicked to Laura, then back to Clara. She tried another angle. "Do you realize the consequences of refusing to comply? This is a disruption. Security can be called. I can escalate this immediately." Clara's gaze flicked briefly toward the gate, then back to Evelyn. Her voice was calm, firm, and precise. "I am aware of your capability to escalate. I have no intention of escalating myself. My concern is fairness and adherence to the airline's policies. Any action taken against me that is not in alignment with policy will be documented." She let the pause linger, allowing passengers and crew alike to sense the weight of her authority. A subtle shift occurred in the cabin. Passengers began to sit straighter, some nodding imperceptibly. Their collective awareness grew. The elderly woman in row 5 adjusted her glasses, eyes narrowing slightly. She had spent decades observing power etiquette and unspoken social rules, and here she was witnessing an elegant confrontation where fairness was being asserted without theatrics or rage. Captain Michael Hawthorne, standing near the cockpit door, finally stepped forward, his voice deep and measured. "What seems to be the issue here?" He did not address Evelyn directly, nor Clara, but spoke to both, letting his authority settle over the cabin. The hum of the engines seemed secondary to the intensity now focused in this small space. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line, shifting slightly in her seat. She had assumed she could control the narrative with her presence and status, yet Clara's calm defiance disrupted her assumptions. "This passenger is refusing to move," Evelyn said smoothly, "and it is delaying the flight." She let her words hang precise, polished, designed to imply urgency without aggression. Clara's eyes scanned the cabin again, taking in each micro-expression. She noticed subtle glances of support from the retired pilot in row 3, the nods of silent acknowledgement from passengers in the back. Every small gesture of observation was a reminder that the social script was being rewritten in real time. Captain Clara said quietly, voice measured, "I am in my assigned seat. The disruption is a perception, not a reality. I am compliant with all safety requirements." Laura Bennett shifted uneasily, recognizing that the moral and procedural authority in the cabin had subtly shifted. Her instincts screamed to act, yet every moment she hesitated, the shift became clearer. Evelyn's composure tightened. "You cannot do this. I can have this resolved immediately. One call and your presence here will be overruled," she said, fingers brushing the phone, a subtle threat intended to assert leverage. Clara's lips curved, ever so slightly controlled and deliberate. "I am aware," she said softly. "And I am aware that fairness is the only currency that holds weight here. The consequences of failing to observe policy will reflect on those who enforce assumptions rather than rules." The words landed like a scalpel in the air, precise, piercing, demanding acknowledgement. Passengers began to murmur softly, the cabin filled with a quiet energy. Eyes shifted, some narrowing, some widening, as everyone processed the unfolding power dynamics. The elderly man in row 4 exhaled slowly, as though releasing tension held for decades. The moral stakes previously abstract were now immediate and visible. Evelyn's hands tightened on her armrest, subtle but unmistakable. She had relied on quiet compliance, on assumptions, on the invisible deference of others. Here was a force she could not command, a presence whose authority existed outside entitlement and social hierarchy. Her breath hitched slightly, the first visible sign of doubt. From the galley, Laura whispered under her breath, almost to herself, "She's not bluffing. This isn't ordinary. This is authority." Her hands trembled slightly, a small but telling betrayal of her internal conflict. She had never encountered a passenger who could command attention without aggression, yet here subtlety carried more weight than any raised voice. A soft click from Clara's tablet drew no immediate attention. Behind the screen, encrypted communications confirmed historical assignments, verified compliance, and recorded every interaction. She did not act yet, only allowed the silent knowledge to fortify her position, a chess player ready for the next move. Evelyn's voice sharpened, her polished cadence now edged with frustration. "Do you even realize who I am? One call, one phone call, this will be resolved." Clara's eyes met hers evenly. "I am aware," she said softly. "And I am also aware that influence is not a substitute for fairness. The cabin air seemed to thicken, every passenger acutely aware of the stakes. A 67-year-old woman in row 5 whispered, "I've seen privilege, but this is different." The older retired executive in row 3 nodded silent recognition in his eyes. The tableau had transformed a simple boarding dispute, had become a study in power perception and morality. Captain Hawthorne exhaled, finally adjusting his posture. "We will proceed," he said, tone firm but acknowledging the shift. "All passengers will comply with policy, and fairness will be observed." His words carried authority, but Clara sensed the true understanding lay in observation, in the subtle acknowledgement of consequence, not in loud decree. Clara's gaze swept the cabin one last time. The retired pilot, the elderly passengers, the quiet nods, all were part of a network of silent witness. Evelyn's hands relaxed fractionally, the tension in her jaw softening. Laura Bennett straightened eyes, shifting with new understanding. The first act had ended, the first wave of revelation complete. The stage was set, the players aligned, and the story was far from over. Every breath, every heartbeat, every micro-expression had been accounted for. Clara leaned back, slightly calm, yet alert. The first confrontation had revealed fractures in authority, entitlement, and perception. The next move would be decisive, and the stakes were now larger than any seat, larger than any individual ego, stretching to the moral conscience of every observer in that cabin. The engines hummed. The cabin lights flickered softly, and Clara Whitman waited, poised, unshaken, aware that this was only the beginning of a reckoning that would ripple far beyond the confines of Flight 721. The flight taxied slowly toward the runway engines, humming steadily, but the tension inside first class had grown into something palpable, almost electric. Clara Whitman remained in her seat, hands lightly folded over her toe ties, scanning the cabin with meticulous attention. Every passenger, every crew member seemed to feel the gravity of the standoff, as if the air itself had thickened around them. Evelyn Carter sat rigidly across the aisle, shoulders squared, eyes darting between Clara and the flight attendants. Her usual composure wavered slightly, though she masked it well with a sharp inhale and a tightening of her jaw. Laura Bennett, the lead flight attendant, shifted near the galley. She was acutely aware of the moral and procedural imbalance, and for the first time, she questioned the years of routine she had executed. Her hands clenched subtly, then relaxed, brushing against the counter, as she tried to maintain neutrality while witnessing something that went beyond policy. Something fundamentally human. She glanced at the other attendants, noting the small, almost imperceptible signs of acknowledgement, the shared tension in their posture, the subtle tilts of heads. From row 3, a retired airline executive, 72, leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Clara. He had spent decades observing the nuances of authority and deference, the unspoken hierarchies that governed cabin life. He had seen confrontations, minor disputes, but this was unprecedented. Clara's calm yet unyielding presence reshaped the social dynamics entirely. Every glance, every slight shift, every breath became a signal, a small disturbance in the established order. Evelyn's voice cut sharply through the quiet, polished and precise. "This is ridiculous. I've been flying this route for years. I know the crew, I know the system. You cannot claim the same seat as me without consequence." She shifted her posture, deliberately leaning forward, letting her designer watch catch the light, a subtle display of wealth and influence. Her tone was edged with authority, but beneath it, a flicker of uncertainty betrayed the cracks in her certainty. Clara's eyes met Evelyn's calm and unflinching. "I am aware of your status, Miss Carter," she said, voice low, deliberate. "I am also aware that status does not grant rights over what has been legitimately assigned. I am here to ensure that policies are applied fairly, not selectively." Her words hung in the cabin, resonating with passengers and crew alike. The hum of the engines, the soft overhead lighting, even the faint rustle of pages from a magazine became part of the cinematic intensity of the moment. Laura Bennett exhaled slowly, her mind racing. The procedural manual offered little guidance when confronted with a passenger whose quiet authority eclipsed the expected hierarchy. Every instinct told her to enforce compliance, yet the ethical dimension was undeniable. She glanced at the young attendants who shifted nervously, aware that the standoff had escalated beyond ordinary protocol. Evelyn's hand moved subtly toward her phone, a motion meant to signal the potential for escalation. Clara's eyes followed the movement without flinching, a silent acknowledgement of the leverage Evelyn thought she possessed. "I am not threatening escalation," Clara said softly, voice firm. "I am requesting observation documentation and adherence. That is all." Her tone carried a weight that settled over the cabin, a subtle but unmistakable claim of authority, not derived from wealth, status, or title. The elderly woman in row 5 adjusted her glasses, leaning slightly forward. She whispered to her companion, "She's not just standing her ground. She's exposing the framework of entitlement." Her companion, a retired professor, nodded quietly, noting the subtleties, the tension in Evelyn's hands, the hesitation in the lead attendant's posture, the collective recognition in the passenger's eyes. Captain Michael Hawthorne stepped closer. His presence measured, authoritative, yet observant. "We must maintain schedule," he said, voice, steady eyes, sweeping the cabin. "I need cooperation from all passengers to ensure safety and timely departure." His statement was neutral, procedural, yet his gaze lingered on Clara, acknowledging without confrontation the power she held in that moment. Evelyn tried another angle. "You don't understand the consequences. Security can be called. I have influence. This can be resolved immediately." Her voice, silk over steel, was intended to dominate. Clara's gaze remained calm, her eyes unblinking. Influence and privilege are not substitutes for fairness. The real consequences belong to those who fail to apply the rules equally. Her words were deliberate, every syllable measured, each pause amplifying the moral weight. Passengers began to lean forward, subtle gestures of attention, of alignment, of acknowledgement. A retired airline consultant whispered, "She's holding them accountable without raising her voice." The energy in the cabin had shifted. It was no longer a simple dispute about a seat. It had become a demonstration of moral and procedural clarity, a reflection of fairness in motion. Laura Bennett felt a shift within herself. She had enforced entitlement before, silently, routinely. Watching Clara, she recognized the courage and the authority, emanating from calm observation and quiet insistence on fairness. Her own moral compass, long suppressed under layers of protocol, now nudged her toward acknowledgement. She straightened subtly, aligning her posture with the newfound moral tension in the cabin. Evelyn's composure began to falter further. She leaned back slightly, lips pressing thin, adjusting the strap of her bag. She had expected automatic compliance, but here was a passenger whose presence reframed every assumption. Clara's hands rested lightly on the armrest, her movements deliberate, but not threatening. A quiet storm held in perfect control. A soft chime from Clara's encrypted tablet went unnoticed by the crew, a silent confirmation of seat assignments, historical compliance, and documentation of the unfolding interaction. She did not act on it immediately, only allowed the information to reinforce her presence, strengthening her confidence and focus. Evelyn's voice rose slightly, a thin edge of exasperation creeping in. "I have connections. One phone call and this will be resolved. You are causing unnecessary delay." Clara's eyes met hers evenly. Connections do not grant rights over what is rightly assigned. The delay is the product of assumptions, not compliance. The cabin seemed to inhale collectively, the words striking each observer with subtle force. Captain Hawthorne exhaled slowly, finally asserting procedural balance. "All passengers will be treated according to assignment," he said firmly, tone even acknowledging the shift in cabin dynamics. The statement was neutral, yet it carried weight, an unspoken concession to the presence of a force that could not be ignored. Clara's gaze swept the cabin one last time, noting micro-expressions, subtle shifts in posture, the unspoken acknowledgement of authority beyond title or status. Evelyn's shoulders relaxed fractionally, her confidence tempered by recognition. Laura Bennett stood straighter, aligning herself with procedural fairness rather than blind deference. The tension had not dissipated. It had transformed. What had begun as a dispute over a single seat had become a study in authority, fairness, and moral reckoning. Each passenger, each crew member, had witnessed a silent assertion of integrity that challenged assumptions and demanded acknowledgement. Clara leaned back, slightly calm but alert, knowing the next phase of the confrontation would reveal the true scope of influence and consequence. The engines continued their steady hum. The cabin lights cast a soft glow over the faces of the passengers, and the first act of the moral standoff concluded. Clara Whitman sat poised, a quiet observer and active participant, simultaneously aware that the unfolding story would extend far beyond the confines of Flight 721, shaping perceptions, testing assumptions, and quietly recalibrating the scales of authority and fairness. The first signs of movement came not from the engines, but from the subtle shifting of passengers in their seats, small gestures that rippled like echoes through the cabin of Flight 721. Clara Whitman remained perfectly still, her posture a study in disciplined calm, yet her mind raced with precise calculations. Every glance, every blink, every slight tilt of the head from the crew and passengers was being catalogued, weighed, and interpreted. Evelyn Carter, seated across the aisle, exuded tension in taut lines across her face. She had anticipated compliance, a brief inconvenience, a minor concession of authority, but the equilibrium had shifted, and she felt it in the tightening of her jaw and the slight tremor of her fingers against the polished leather of her armrest. Laura Bennett, the lead flight attendant, felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever before. She had followed protocol countless times, ensuring VIP passengers were accommodated, maintaining the unspoken hierarchies that governed first-class etiquette. But now she realized the script she had relied upon for years had been disrupted. Her eyes flicked repeatedly between Clara and Evelyn, noting the subtlest movements, the way Clara's gaze commanded attention, without aggression, the way Evelyn's composure struggled to mask her uncertainty. Captain Michael Hawthorne stepped slightly closer to the galley voice, calm but deliberate. "We need to ensure this flight departs safely and on schedule. Everyone's cooperation is required." He did not raise his voice, nor did he single out any passenger. Yet his presence carried authority, a reminder that the rules of procedure existed for safety above all. Clara acknowledged him with a subtle nod, her eyes briefly meeting his, conveying recognition and compliance while maintaining her moral and procedural stance. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, her voice polished but sharp. "I've flown this route for years. I have a record with this airline. I expect to be accommodated." Her tone carried not only assertion, but an implied threat, the kind that came from years of leveraging status and influence. Clara's gaze met hers evenly unwavering. "I understand," she said softly. "Deliberate. But expectation is not entitlement. Compliance with assignment applies equally to all passengers. My seat is confirmed, and I intend to remain in it." A hush fell over the cabin. The hum of the engines became background almost imperceptible as the subtle drama unfolded. Passengers adjusted, some leaning forward, others reclining with attentive awareness. In row 4, a retired airline consultant in his late 60s exhaled, slowly noticing the pattern of power and influence being challenged with quiet authority. His hands rested lightly on his knees, eyes observing the minute interactions, Evelyn's shifting weight, Laura's tentative gestures, the unflinching poise of Clara. A soft click echoed from Clara's tablet, unnoticed by the crew. She had discreetly activated secure communications with her legal counsel and internal observers, sending real-time documentation of the situation to verify compliance and ensure accountability. The notification reinforced her awareness without altering her calm exterior. She did not speak of it. She did not act immediately. It was a subtle accumulation of leverage, a tool of observation and preparation. Evelyn's fingers brushed her phone, the movement deliberate, signaling readiness to escalate. Clara's eyes followed the gesture, without flinching, absorbing the intent passing it. "I am not threatening escalation," Clara said, voice low but carrying through the cabin. "I am observing, documenting, and ensuring policy is applied consistently. That is all." The words were simple, yet absolute. The surrounding passengers felt their weight, sensing the moral force behind them. Laura Bennett exhaled again, her mind a whirl of procedure, safety, and ethical conflict. She had always executed rules with mechanical precision, but now the human element, the moral clarity and presence of authority from a single passenger, was asserting itself in a way she could not ignore. She glanced subtly at the other attendants, seeing reflections of her own tension and realization mirrored in their posture and expressions. From row 3, the retired pilot in his early 70s shifted forward, a subtle but deliberate acknowledgement of Clara's control over the moral and procedural dimension of the cabin. He had spent decades navigating the unspoken hierarchies of airline operations, and yet here in real time he recognized a different kind of authority at work, one not grounded in status or title but in clarity, composure, and observation. Evelyn's voice rose slightly, a thread of frustration breaking through her polished exterior. "Do you even realize the consequences of defiance security can be called? I know people. This can be resolved instantly." Clara's eyes, unblinking, met hers directly. "I am aware," she said softly, precise. "And I am also aware that influence does not replace fairness. The consequences of failing to follow policy will reflect on those who act on assumption rather than assignment." Passengers shifted subtly, some nodding, imperceptibly, others maintaining stillness with intent focus. The 65-year-old woman in row 5 whispered to her companion. Finally, someone holding them accountable. The companion, a retired executive, inclined his head, understanding the gravity of the dynamics unfolding. The cabin, once merely a transport space, had transformed into a theater of observation, moral reckoning, and subtle power negotiation. Captain Hawthorne exhaled slowly, acknowledging the shift without overt comment. "All passengers will be treated according to confirmed assignments," he said firmly. The statement carried authority, procedural clarity, and tacit recognition of Clara's presence and influence. The cabin absorbed the words. Tension lingered, but it was now tempered by a collective acknowledgement that fairness had been asserted. A slight murmur arose from the back of the cabin. A retired flight attendant in her late 60s, seated quietly, leaned forward just enough to catch Clara's eye. There was a shared understanding, unspoken but present, that the display of calm authority in the midst of expected deference had shifted something fundamental. Even Evelyn's posture relaxed fractionally, the rigid lines of entitlement beginning to yield under the weight of observed integrity. Clara's subtle second twist emerged silently. Her encrypted tablet displayed confirmations from secure communications channels, historical seat assignments, airline compliance records, and documentation of similar disputes, all synchronized to provide real-time verification. She did not announce it. She let it exist as a latent force, one that strengthened her position without dramatic display. The quiet knowledge reinforced her authority, even as her demeanor remained composed. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the tablet, though she did not see the details. She felt a shift, an unseen pressure, an intuitive understanding that the balance of power was no longer entirely hers. The subtle tremor in her fingers, the slight tightening of her jaw, betrayed the first hints of doubt. Clara's presence was no longer passive. It had become an unspoken assertion of procedural and moral weight. Laura Bennett adjusted her stance, feeling the internal alignment of her duty shifting. She had spent years enforcing a system that often privileged influence over fairness. Now witnessing the quiet command emanating from Clara, she realized the authority of calm observation could outweigh entitlement. Her shoulders squared, slightly small, but significant, as she positioned herself to enforce policy with integrity rather than mere compliance. Evelyn, sensing her previously unchallenged position was under scrutiny, attempted one final assertion. "This is absurd. I am a valued customer. One call and the situation is resolved." Clara's gaze, unwavering, met hers. Valued does not mean above assignment. Entitlement does not replace compliance. Observation is ongoing. Accountability will follow where it is warranted. The cabin seemed to collectively exhale, the tension transforming into a shared acknowledgement of moral and procedural equilibrium. Every passenger crew member and observer understood without words that the dynamics of privilege, authority, and fairness had been challenged and recalibrated. Clara's hands rested lightly on the armrest, the calm epicenter of a storm, measured and precise. The engines continued their steady hum, the overhead lights glimmered softly, and the first act of moral reckoning had concluded. Yet beneath the composed surface, the potential for escalation, revelation, and change lingered a promise of consequence and reflection that would extend far beyond the confines of Flight 721. Clara leaned back, slightly alert, poised, and entirely in control of the subtle currents she had set in motion, aware that the true test of authority, fairness, and accountability was only just beginning. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as Flight 721 climbed through the thin, crisp air above Massachusetts. Clara Whitman remained poised in Seat 2A, her eyes scanning the passengers and crew with methodical precision. The hum of the engines was a constant backdrop, but the tension in first class was far louder than any mechanical sound. Evelyn Carter, seated across the aisle, had shifted subtly in her seat, one hand brushing against the polished leather armrest, her posture taut. She had expected compliance, a simple concession, and yet the situation had evolved into something she could neither control nor predict. Laura Bennett moved quietly toward the galley, her mind a whirlwind of procedure protocol and ethics. She had spent years enforcing airline rules that often bent under the weight of VIP entitlement. Yet now she was witnessing a passenger whose quiet authority reframed the entire cabin dynamic. Every subtle gesture, Clara's calm posture, Evelyn's tightening shoulders, the way passengers leaned forward or straightened in their seats, was being absorbed, interpreted, catalogued. Laura felt a deep tension in her chest, a mix of anticipation and unease, as the reality of this confrontation settled over her. From row 3, a retired flight operations consultant, 74, observed with sharp attention. His eyes followed every micro-expression, every slight adjustment in body language. He had spent decades analyzing the nuances of cabin behavior, the invisible hierarchies, the unspoken deference, and yet this was unlike any scenario he had seen. Clara's presence did not demand attention through volume or threat. It commanded awareness through precision, composure, and moral clarity. Evelyn leaned forward slightly, voice smooth, but carrying an unmistakable edge of frustration. "I've flown this route for over a decade. I have expectations, and I intend for them to be honored. You are creating an unnecessary disruption." Her words were carefully chosen, designed to assert control without raising her voice too high. Her hand moved subtly toward her phone, a silent gesture meant to reinforce leverage. Clara's gaze met hers evenly. Expectations are not entitlement. Compliance with confirmed assignments applies to all passengers equally. I am here to observe fairness, not to create conflict. Her voice was low, but carried through the cabin with a quiet authority, forcing passengers to pay attention, to feel the weight of her assertion. The elderly woman in row 5 shifted forward slightly, whispering, finally, someone holding them accountable. The retired consultant nodded, subtly absorbing the unfolding dynamics. Laura Bennett exhaled slowly, her internal conflict mounting. She had always enforced policies mechanically, sometimes bending rules for convenience or pressure. But now the authority she had known was being challenged in a way that left no room for moral compromise. She noticed subtle gestures among her colleagues, hesitation, shared glances, the unspoken acknowledgement that the normal script had fractured. Captain Michael Hawthorne stepped closer to the galley, his voice calm but firm. All passengers must comply with policy. Safety and schedule are our priorities. His eyes swept over the cabin, assessing tension, measuring reactions. Clara's head tilted in acknowledgement, a silent confirmation that she understood the procedural hierarchy, even as she maintained her position of moral authority. Evelyn's voice rose slightly sharper now, as frustration seeped into her carefully controlled tone. "Do you realize the consequences I can call security? I have connections that can escalate this immediately." Clara's gaze did not waver. "I am aware," she replied softly, deliberate, each word measured. "And I'm aware that influence does not replace fairness. Any consequences arising from failure to comply with policy will reflect on those responsible for enforcing assumptions rather than assignments." Passengers shifted subtly their body language, reflecting a growing awareness. Some leaned forward, others exhaled slowly, the cabin collectively recognizing the stakes of the moral confrontation. The 68-year-old woman in row 6 adjusted her glasses, watching closely. She had spent a lifetime observing authority privilege and etiquette, and now she saw a quiet assertion of integrity that was reshaping the hierarchy in real time. A soft click sounded from Clara's tablet, unnoticed by crew or passengers. Encrypted communication, verified seat assignments, historical compliance, and potential conflicts, transmitting discreetly to her legal and operational advisors. She did not act immediately, only allowed the information to bolster her strategic awareness, reinforcing her presence without dramatic display. Evelyn's posture stiffened further, her voice now tinged with impatience. "This is absurd. One phone call and the situation will be resolved. You are creating unnecessary delay." Clara's gaze remained unwavering. "I am not causing a delay. Delay is the product of assumptions, not compliance. Observation is ongoing. Accountability will follow where warranted." The passengers' reactions were subtle but clear. Heads tilted small nods, exchanged eyes meeting briefly in recognition. The cabin had transformed from a transport space into a moral theater. Every passenger crew member and observer sensed that the confrontation was about more than a seat. It was about integrity, fairness, and the weight of authority. Captain Hawthorne exhaled slowly, his tone steady as he asserted procedural balance. "All passengers will be treated according to confirmed assignments. That is the policy of this airline." His words were neutral, yet carried the recognition that Clara's presence had altered the dynamics of authority. The cabin absorbed the statement, tension tempered by acknowledgement of fairness. From the rear of the cabin, an older flight attendant retired, but observing as a passenger whispered softly, "She's showing them the weight of responsibility without raising her voice." The sentiment was shared silently among several observers, a subtle recognition of the moral clarity unfolding in front of them. Evelyn's fingers twitched near her phone, a final desperate attempt to assert dominance. Clara's gaze followed the movement with steady precision, unflinching, absorbing the implied threat without reaction. "Influence does not override policy," she said softly, each word deliberate. "Fairness applies to every passenger equally." The subtle third twist emerged. A notification on Clara's secure tablet confirmed historical seat assignments and compliance data, silently reinforcing her position and providing an irrefutable record of interactions. The passengers did not see it, but its presence shifted the weight in the cabin. Every unspoken acknowledgement, every careful observation now carried new significance. Laura Bennett felt the internal pressure shift. The years of executing routine-bending rules under quiet pressure had collided with a moment of moral clarity. She straightened imperceptibly, aligning herself with the principle of fairness rather than convenience or intimidation. Evelyn, sensing her authority undermined, adjusted in her seat, shoulders tightening, but a fraction of doubt had crept into her carefully constructed composure. The cabin seemed to hold its collective breath. Passengers of all ages leaned slightly forward, observing, processing, feeling the ethical tension. Clara's hands rested lightly on the armrest, her presence the calm epicenter of a storm that required no raised voice to command attention. Every micro-expression, every subtle gesture, every flicker of movement was part of the narrative unfolding in real time. Clara's voice, low and precise, carried across the cabin. "This seat is mine. I am remaining in it. I am fully compliant. Any deviation from policy will be noted, documented, and addressed." The words landed like a soft but inexorable tide, washing over the cabin, leaving no room for assumption or entitlement. The engines continued their steady hum. Cabin lights reflected off polished surfaces, highlighting the subtle shifts of posture, the tightened hands, the quiet nods. First class was no longer simply a transport space. It was a stage for authority, fairness, and moral reckoning. Clara leaned back, slightly alert, and poised, fully aware that the next phase of the confrontation would reveal consequences far beyond the walls of the aircraft. Passengers sat rapt, crew tense, yet reflective, and Evelyn Carter's polished confidence had fractured ever so slightly. The first act of confrontation had concluded, but the moral and procedural dynamics were now set. The stage was prepared, the players aligned, and the unfolding story promised repercussions that would extend far beyond Flight 721. Clara Whitman remained at the center, calm, collected, and fully aware of the ripple her presence would create. The flight leveled off above the cloud line, sunlight slicing through small gaps, casting slanted golden beams across the first-class cabin. Clara Whitman remained seated in 2AA study in unshakable calm. Her eyes moved deliberately from passenger to passenger, from crew member to crew member, absorbing micro-expressions, subtle gestures, and unspoken calculations. Evelyn Carter, across the aisle, shifted uneasily in her seat, fingertips drumming lightly against her leather bag. She had entered this flight expecting compliance, a routine concession, but each moment of Clara's quiet authority eroded the certainty that had sustained her influence for years. Laura Bennett, standing near the galley, felt the weight of the moment pressing against her spine. For years she had enforced protocol and quietly acquiesced to VIP privilege, but the balance had shifted. Clara's presence was not just defiance, it was an unspoken assertion of fairness and observation that Laura could not ignore. The crew exchanged glances, subtle and loaded each, acknowledging that the usual scripts had fractured. From row 3, a retired operations manager, 73, leaned forward slightly, noting the interactions. He had seen power exercised in countless ways, often veiled, often quiet, but the combination of poise, precision, and moral weight emanating from Clara was rare. Each sentence she spoke, each subtle posture, each measured glance was an assertion of authority rooted in integrity rather than title wealth or status. Evelyn leaned forward, voice smooth, but now edged with frustration. You realize the implications of refusing to move, don't you? I have influence. Security can be called. This can be resolved immediately. Her tone, though low, carried the weight of expectation, of decades of assumed control. Clara's gaze met hers without flinching. Influence is not a substitute for compliance, she said softly, deliberate. Fairness is not negotiable. Any failure to observe policy will reflect on those responsible. The cabin responded subtly. Passengers leaned slightly forward, some exhaling slowly, others gripping armrests with a quiet tension. The elderly couple in row 5 whispered to each other, noting the elegance and discipline of Clara's stance. The retired consultant nodded imperceptibly, absorbing the unfolding social and ethical dynamics. It was a moment where human observation, moral clarity, and procedural rigor intersected. Captain Michael Hawthorne approached, slightly voice-measured, carrying authority without aggression. All passengers must comply with assignment. Safety and schedule are paramount. His eyes lingered on Clara, a tacit acknowledgement of the force she carried without elevation, in voice or display of status. Clara inclined her head, subtly, silently recognizing authority, while asserting her own. Evelyn's jaw tightened frustration, sharpening her expression. I've flown this route for years. I have expectations. I do not accept this challenge to my authority lightly. Her hand brushed against the strap of her bag, a silent signal of leverage, poised to escalate. Clara's eyes followed, recording, analyzing. Expectations do not replace rights, she said softly, but with unmistakable weight. The seat assignment is confirmed. I am here to ensure policy is applied equally. Observation is ongoing. Accountability will follow where warranted." The passengers responded in subtle ways, slight nods, small shifts attention sharpened. The cabin had transformed from a space of routine luxury into a stage for ethical reckoning. The 68-year-old retired pilot in row 3 adjusted in his seat, noting the interplay of posture, gesture, and verbal precision. Clara's calm had become an unspoken challenge, forcing each observer to consider the balance between assumed authority and procedural correctness. A soft chime from Clara's encrypted tablet went unnoticed by others. Real-time verification of seat assignments, historical compliance data and documentation of interactions flowed discreetly to her and her advisors. She did not announce it, did not act on it, but the presence of the information reinforced her confidence, silently signaling preparedness for escalation if needed. Evelyn's composure began to fray. Her smooth confidence, her expectation of deference, met the unyielding calm of someone who commanded attention without force. She inhaled sharply, eyes narrowing, subtle tremors passing through her hands. The cabin seemed to sense the shift. Tension rippled through passengers and crew alike. Laura Bennett straightened imperceptibly, aligning herself with integrity rather than habitual deference. Clara's voice, low precise, resonated through the cabin. "This seat is mine. I am compliant. I intend to remain here. Any deviation from policy will be documented." Each word carried weight beyond the immediate situation, a signal to all observers that fairness wouldn't be overridden by influence or expectation. The elderly passengers leaned forward slightly, recognizing the assertion of integrity and procedure simultaneously. The subtle third twist emerged when a notification appeared on Clara's tablet, confirming prior assignments, procedural history, and legal verification of compliance. Though the crew and passengers did not see it, it was a latent reinforcement of her authority. Every glance, every micro-expression now carried amplified significance. Observers sensed the presence of a silent, unassailable record. Laura Bennett adjusted subtly, hands unclenching posture slightly more upright. The years of routine compliance and silent enforcement of entitlement had collided with the reality of an undeniable moral presence. She recognized, perhaps for the first time, that procedure without integrity was hollow, and that quiet assertion could reshape behavior. Evelyn, sensing her grip loosening, attempted one final assertion. "This is excessive. You are just one passenger, one phone call, and this situation can be resolved." Clara's gaze met hers evenly. Influence is not authority. Fairness is not negotiable. The consequence of failing to comply with policy will rest with those who act on assumptions rather than assignments. Passengers' reactions were subtle, but noticeable. Slight nods, quiet exhalations, shifting of posture, all indicated awareness of a moral recalibration occurring in real time. The cabin had transformed from mere transportation space into a microcosm of accountability, integrity, and ethical observation. Clara's hands rested lightly on the armrest. Her presence, the calm epicenter of a storm, managed entirely with discipline and observation. Captain Hawthorne exhaled his statement, measured and firm. "All passengers will be treated according to confirmed assignments. That is the policy." His words carried authority and tacit recognition of Clara's presence, and the cabin absorbed the pronouncement with a collective subdued acknowledgement. Evelyn's hands twitched again, near her bag, a final desperate signal of influence. Clara observed without reaction, letting the gesture float in the air unaddressed, yet acknowledged. Observation is ongoing. Clara said softly, deliberate. Accountability will follow, where policy is not applied equally. The subtle fourth twist arrived when a low encrypted alert appeared on Clara's tablet, notifying her of communication from airline headquarters. Internal operations had logged discrepancies in seat assignments and VIP accommodations, confirming that her presence had highlighted systemic deviation. She did not act immediately, only allowed the awareness to sharpen her perception, reinforcing the moral and procedural stakes of the confrontation. Passengers remained attentive, observing the dynamics without fully understanding the hidden layers of authority. Evelyn's face reflected a mixture of realization and unease. Laura Bennett's posture was no longer one of automatic enforcement, but measured judgment. The retired pilot and consultant leaned forward quietly, acknowledging the rare interplay of moral authority and procedural rigor displayed before them. Clara's final words for the moment were quiet, measured, and absolute. "This seat is mine. I am in compliance. Policy applies to all passengers equally. Any deviations will be noted and addressed." The words resonated subtly, yet firmly, rippling through the cabin. The engines hummed steadily, the lights cast soft reflections, and the first-class cabin had become a stage for ethical clarity, observation, and unspoken consequence. The moral standoff had reached a temporary equilibrium. Clara remained alert, poised, fully aware that this was only the first phase of a confrontation that would extend far beyond the confines of the aircraft. Every passenger, every crew member had been quietly engaged in a lesson of authority, fairness, and accountability. The next phase would reveal consequences, ripple effects, and the potential for transformation that extended well beyond Flight 721. The sunlight angled through the windows, catching the polished surfaces and illuminating the subtle gestures, micro-expressions, and quiet acknowledgments. Clara leaned back, slightly still, vigilant, a calm epicenter of judgment, patience, and preparation. The aircraft sailed steadily above the clouds, a silent witness to the unfolding moral reckoning. The stage was set. The players aligned, and the story, far from concluding, was gathering momentum, anticipation, and consequence. The cabin lights flickered briefly as the plane leveled at 35,000 feet, a golden haze from the setting sun painting the rows of first-class seats. Clara Whitman remained in 2A, her posture, unwavering eyes, scanning, cataloging, absorbing. Every micro-expression, every subtle movement from passengers and crew was recorded in her mind with meticulous care. The cabin had transformed from a space of ordinary luxury into a crucible where social norms, privilege, and authority were being silently tested. Evelyn Carter, seated across the aisle, straightened again, shoulders stiff, a barely perceptible twitch at her temple, betraying her growing unease. Laura Bennett hovered near the galley, feeling the pressure of responsibility tighten around her chest. She had spent years executing protocol, mechanically accommodating entitlement without question. Yet here she was, witnessing a passenger whose calm defiance disrupted every assumption she had relied upon. Her eyes flicked to her fellow attendants, noting the subtle cues of uncertainty and recognition. Each small gesture reinforced the tension, the weight of observation, and the moral reckoning unfolding in real time. A retired operations executive in row 3 leaned forward, slightly eyes narrowed in fascination. He had observed power exercised quietly, subtly for decades, yet Clara's presence felt different. It carried precision, composure, and a moral authority that demanded acknowledgement without raising a voice. Each word she spoke, each gesture she made, each moment of stillness was a declaration of principle, an unspoken challenge to entitlement and assumption. Evelyn leaned forward, voice carefully controlled, but laced with urgency. You realize the implications, don't you? One call and this situation could be resolved. You're causing unnecessary disruption. Her hand brushed the strap of her designer bag, a subtle but deliberate signal of power and leverage. Clara's eyes tracked the motion without flinching. I am aware, she said softly, each syllable deliberate. And I am also aware that influence is not authority. Fairness cannot be bypassed by expectation or status. Any deviation from policy will be noted and addressed. The passengers shifted slightly, some leaning forward, some adjusting in their seats, all absorbing the unfolding moral and procedural tension. A woman in row 5 in her mid-60s whispered to her companion, finally someone holding them accountable. Her companion, a retired consultant, nodded subtly, eyes tracing the interplay of authority composure and procedural correctness. The cabin had become a theatre of ethical observation. Captain Michael Hawthorne stepped closer to the front, voice firm, but measured. All passengers will comply with confirmed seat assignments. Safety and schedule are priorities. His eyes lingered on Clara, acknowledging her presence and authority without confrontation. Clara inclined her head slightly, a subtle acknowledgement of his procedural authority while maintaining her moral and strategic position. Evelyn's voice sharpened slightly, frustration bleeding through the polish. I've flown this route for years. I am accustomed to priority treatment. You cannot override that with mere assertion. Clara's gaze remained fixed, calm, and deliberate. I am not overriding anything. I am observing. I am documenting. Compliance with confirmed assignments applies to all passengers equally. Observation ensures accountability, nothing more. A soft chime sounded from Clara's tablet, unnoticed by crew or passengers. Secure verification of seat assignments, historical compliance records, and documentation of interactions flowed quietly to her advisors. She did not act immediately. She allowed the knowledge to reinforce her authority, silently preparing for any escalation while maintaining perfect composure. Evelyn's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. Her polished veneer had relied on automatic compliance, habitual deference, and unspoken intimidation. Now facing calm, deliberate assertion, she felt the first cracks in her confidence. Her shoulders tightened, a subtle exhale escaping her lips as she recognized that the balance of power was no longer entirely hers. Laura Bennett adjusted her stance subtly. She had enforced preferential treatment for years without questioning it, but now the moral clarity emanating from Clara left her no option but to acknowledge fairness over convenience. She straightened imperceptibly, aligning herself with integrity rather than routine acquiescence. Clara's voice, low and precise, cut through the charged silence. This seat is mine. I am compliant. I will remain here. Any deviations from policy will be recorded and addressed accordingly. Each word landed with quiet force, resonating through the cabin, carrying weight far beyond the immediate moment. The 68-year-old retired pilot in row 3 leaned forward, nodding subtly, understanding the unique display of authority that required neither volume nor threat. The cabin had become a study in power perception and moral clarity. Each passenger crew member and observer was a participant, conscious or unconscious in the unfolding lesson. Evelyn's hands twitched near her bag, a final attempt at leverage, yet Clara's gaze, calm and unflinching, met hers squarely. Authority is measured by adherence to principle, not by influence or expectation, Clara said softly. The statement carried through the rows, subtle but unmistakable, grounding the cabin in observation and reflection. Captain Hawthorne exhaled slowly, acknowledging the shift in cabin dynamics. "Confirmed assignments will be honored," he said. His words carried authority, procedural clarity, and tacit recognition of the influence Clara wielded without display or escalation. Passengers absorbed the declaration tension, tempered by a sense of fairness restored. From the rear, an older flight attendant retired, but observing as a passenger whispered softly, "She's demonstrating control without aggression." The sentiment spread subtly, a quiet acknowledgement from those with experience, signaling recognition of moral and procedural clarity. The subtle fourth twist revealed itself when a secure alert appeared on Clara's tablet, notifying her of prior compliance discrepancies, seat reassignment, irregularities, and historical VIP interventions. Though invisible to the cabin, it reinforced her presence, sharpening her perception, and ensuring that any action moving forward would be informed, precise, and authoritative. Passengers adjusted their posture, leaning forward or straightening, subtly absorbing the moral and procedural dynamics. Evelyn's face reflected unease, her previously unchallenged authority confronted by a quiet force. Laura Bennett's body language had shifted, aligning with integrity, guided by moral clarity rather than habitual compliance. Even the younger crew members, observing the subtle signals, began to internalize the recalibration of authority occurring before them. Clara's final words for the phase were deliberate, clear, and unyielding. "This seat is mine. Compliance applies equally. Any deviation from policy will be noted and addressed. Observation is ongoing. Accountability follows." The words settled in the cabin, each listener recognizing the unspoken implication privilege alone would not determine outcome. The engines hummed steadily, the cabin lights cast long reflections across polished surfaces, and the moral confrontation had achieved a temporary equilibrium. Clara remained alert, poised, aware that the next moves would determine not just immediate compliance, but the broader implications for authority, fairness, and ethical observation. The stage was set for escalation, the ripples of influence extending far beyond the aircraft, reaching every corner of the social and procedural ecosystem. Passengers sat quietly, some nodding subtly, others absorbing the weight of the confrontation in reflection. Evelyn Carter's composure had shifted, subtle tremors betraying uncertainty. Laura Bennett's stance had realigned, integrity momentarily restored in the face of challenge. Clara Whitman remained the calm center, poised, vigilant, aware that the most decisive moments of the confrontation had yet to arrive. The sun slanted further through the windows, illuminating faces, subtle gestures, and micro-expressions. The cabin had transformed into a theater, where ethical clarity, procedural adherence, and human observation intersected. Clara leaned back, slightly alert, and composed, the epicenter of calm authority and moral influence. The story was far from over, but the trajectory had been irrevocably set. The descent began over Boston Harbor, the city lights glittering beneath the clouds like scattered gold dust. Clara Whitman remained in seat 2A. Her hands resting lightly on her taut eyes, sweeping the cabin with meticulous care. The hum of the engines and the subtle vibration of the aircraft were secondary to the intensity that had settled over first class. Evelyn Carter, across the aisle, now sat rigid, shoulders squared, the practiced confidence she had relied on for years crumbling under the weight of observation and consequence. Laura Bennett moved quietly near the galley, her posture straighter than it had been in years. She had witnessed something extraordinary authority exercised not with volume or threat, but with unassailable calm, moral clarity and procedural precision. The crew exchanged subtle glances, each acknowledging the fracture in the usual hierarchy, each registering the weight of accountability that Clara had introduced into the cabin. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some leaning forward, others exhaling slowly, all absorbed in the subtle shifts of power and ethical clarity unfolding before them. A retired airline executive, 75 in row 3, noted every micro-expression, every slight change in posture, every controlled gesture. He understood the stakes, the rare interplay of quiet authority and moral force, and the implications that would extend far beyond this single flight. Clara's gaze lingered briefly on Evelyn, who now fidgeted slightly, hands clasping and unclasping the strap of her bag. The polished composure that had previously radiated authority was now taut with uncertainty. Evelyn's attempts to reassert control had failed silently, yet completely. The passengers sensed it without needing words. Clara's calm presence had inverted the expected power structure, creating a silent hierarchy that demanded recognition. From the rear, a retired flight attendant, observing as a passenger, whispered to a companion, "She's showing them what authority looks like," without raising her voice. The words spread subtly through the cabin, the sentiment quietly acknowledged by passengers and crew alike. The tension was now tempered by recognition. This was a demonstration of integrity, fairness, and observation in its most disciplined form. Captain Michael Hawthorne spoke again, voice-measured, carrying authority while acknowledging the shift. Confirmed seat assignments will be honored. All passengers will comply with policy. His gaze swept the cabin, lingering on Clara with acknowledgement. Clara inclined her head slightly, signaling recognition of procedural authority while maintaining moral clarity. Evelyn's hands twitched near her phone, a last desperate attempt at influence. Clara's eyes tracked the movement without reaction, allowing the gesture to exist unchallenged, but acknowledged. "Observation is ongoing," Clara said softly. "Accountability will follow where policy is not applied equally." Her words carried weight, quiet, but absolute, resonating through the cabin. The subtle twist revealed itself as Clara's encrypted tablet displayed notifications from secure communications, historical seat assignments, internal compliance records, and documentation of prior discrepancies in VIP treatment. Though invisible to the passengers and crew, the latent force reinforced her position and informed her strategic awareness. Every look, every slight gesture, every micro-expression now carried amplified significance. Laura Bennett straightened imperceptibly, the tension in her shoulders easing. Years of following protocol without question, bending for entitlement, and acquiescing silently, had collided with an assertion of moral authority she could neither override nor ignore. Her gaze flicked to Clara, a subtle acknowledgement of the lesson in integrity she had witnessed. Evelyn Carter, realizing her position of assumed influence had been neutralized, leaned back slightly. The polished composure she relied on had shifted under the weight of accountability. Her lips pressed into a thin line, eyes narrowing as she assessed the true extent of Clara's authority. The cabin collectively seemed to exhale, awareness settling like a quiet storm. Clara's final words before landing were deliberate, precise, and unwavering. "This seat is mine. Policy applies equally to all passengers. Any deviation will be documented. Observation is ongoing, and accountability follows where fairness is not applied." Each word landed like a soft hammer, subtle yet undeniable, resonating in the cabin and embedding itself in the awareness of every observer. Passengers reacted subtly, but meaningfully nods of acknowledgement. Quiet exhalations, shifts in posture, reflecting internal processing. The cabin had become a theatre of ethical observation, moral clarity, and subtle influence. Evelyn's expression reflected recognition, unease, and a reluctant acceptance of accountability. Laura Bennett's stance had realigned integrity, now guiding her actions, a quiet lesson, absorbed and internalized. Captain Hawthorne's voice came again, steady, procedural, yet carrying an unspoken acknowledgement of the equilibrium Clara had established. All passengers will be treated according to confirmed assignments. Compliance is required. His tone reinforced authority, but it was tempered by the recognition that moral clarity had reshaped the cabin's dynamics. Clara's hands rested lightly on the armrest, a calm epicenter amid a charged environment. Every gesture, every glance, every small shift had been considered, catalogued, and absorbed by those around her. The descent continued, engines humming steadily, as the subtle ripples of observation and consequence extended to each passenger, each crew member, each witness to authority exercised without aggression. As the aircraft neared Logan International, passengers braced for landing. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the cabin, illuminating subtle expressions: relief, acknowledgement, reflection. Clara remained poised, aware that the confrontation had set in motion more than procedural compliance. It had introduced a new standard of accountability, fairness, and moral observation. The wheels touched the tarmac with a smooth, controlled impact. The cabin shivered slightly as the aircraft slowed, passengers adjusting with careful attention. Laura Bennett exhaled a subtle smile of quiet relief, crossing her face, acknowledgement of the lesson learned. Evelyn Carter remained rigid, the veneer of dominance gone, replaced by a nuanced understanding that influence without fairness held no power here. Clara gathered her tote, standing gracefully, every movement deliberate. The passengers had witnessed a quiet but profound shift, authority wielded without volume, fairness enforced without aggression, observation extending to consequences, unspoken but inevitable. The cabin had absorbed the lesson. First class was no longer just a space of privilege. It had become a crucible for ethical reckoning. As passengers disembarked, many paused, glancing toward Clara with respect, subtle acknowledgement, and quiet admiration. Crew members straightened further, understanding that the procedural norms they had relied upon would never be interpreted in the same way again. The elderly couple from row 5 offered a quiet nod, a shared moment of recognition. The retired consultant in row 3 adjusted his coat eyes, thoughtful, absorbing the implications. Outside the aircraft, the city lights of Boston reflected in the polished tarmac. Clara walked toward the terminal with measured steps, every motion calm, deliberate, commanding respect, without a word raised in volume. Evelyn Carter followed behind, restrained, her influence diminished by the quiet, undeniable authority Clara had demonstrated. Laura Bennett moved alongside, subtly transformed by the experience, her sense of procedural responsibility now entwined with moral clarity. Passengers and crew would carry the memory of this flight forward, each subtly altered by what they had witnessed. Authority had been challenged, privilege had been confronted, and fairness had prevailed, not with shouting, not with confrontation, but through calm observation, deliberate action, and unshakable principle. The story of Flight 721 had become a testament to moral authority in motion, a lesson embedded in every subtle glance, gesture, and decision within the cabin. As Clara exited into the terminal, she glanced back once, a faint, deliberate acknowledgement to the passengers and crew who had absorbed the lesson. The ripples of her actions would extend far beyond the flight itself, a quiet recalibration of expectation, authority, and ethical conduct. She stepped forward each pace, measured, aware that the journey of influence, observation, and accountability continued beyond the confines of first class, beyond the airport, and into every interaction shaped by fairness and principle. Remember this moment, she thought, as passengers carried the lesson into their lives. Fairness matters, observation matters, and accountability cannot be bypassed. Like this story, subscribe for more, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Act now.